Hello everyone, my name is Daniel Backer and welcome to Write Better Stories. Today we're going to talk about the new film by Ari Aster called Midsommar. I saw this after work on Tuesday and it was an awesome theatrical experience. So let me just get right into it, but before I do, let me say there will be major spoilers in this video, so go ahead and turn it off if you haven't seen Midsommar yet, or watch my video instead of Midsommar. I don't know why you'd want to, but do whatever you want. So, in the video today, we're going to be doing an exercise on Midsommar that I mentioned in my previous video titled something along the lines of Why Originality is Bad. So go ahead and watch that video if you want me to explain that provocative statement. But one of the exercises that I mentioned in that video is boiling down a story to an essential thesis statement. I refer to it as an elevator pitch or logline in that video, which in retrospect might not have been the best way to describe it, because typically in an elevator pitch or a logline, you don't give away the entire ending of the film. But today, for the exercise, to help us write better stories, we are going to give away the ending of the film. And so I'm going to do that exercise for Midsommar, talk about some things that I think Midsommar did very successfully, and then some things that I think we can critique from a writing perspective. So go ahead and leave any feedback in the comments if you think that I'm right on the money or completely off the mark. Let's get into it. So, for this exercise, again, we're going to try to boil down Midsommar to an essential thesis statement or a single sentence that describes the main character's character arc, the central investigation of the story, the bare bones of what Midsommar is trying to do. And so I have identified this as follows. When Dani's sister kills herself and her parents, Dani goes to a midsummer festival where she develops a new sense of family, addresses the trauma of her sister's suicide, and gets rid of her shitty boyfriend. I think this is essentially what Midsommar is about. I think we can maybe haggle over some of the details of the way that I phrased it. For example, Dani gets invited to this festival. It's not like she goes there in order to get over her sister's suicide and her sister killing her parents. But this is kind of the broad strokes, so don't get too focused in on any one of the details, but just so that you've got it in your mind, I'm going to say it one more time. And if you think I'm completely off on this, maybe come up with your own thesis statement for Midsommar and then see if the film is successful or unsuccessful at delivering on that thesis. But again, I'll say it for you now, the one that I have identified. When Dani's sister kills herself and her parents, Dani goes to a midsummer festival where she develops a new sense of family, addresses the trauma of her sister's suicide and double homicide, and gets rid of her shitty boyfriend. So, it's a little clunky. We do, have the list that I have created in this little thesis statement, but I think for our purposes, this is pretty good for what we're supposed to be doing with it. So, even though I have no idea how Ari Aster developed this story, I don't know if some of the details came out on set or if he had a completely airtight script before he started shooting, but for our purposes today, we're going to assume that he came up with this general thesis statement that I have identified and then tried to develop a film around this thesis statement. So then, like I was saying, we can evaluate what in the film supported this thesis statement, what distracted from it, what maybe had nothing to do with it whatsoever. And again, leave your comments in the comments if you think I'm right or wrong. So I think that some of the things that very successfully demonstrated this thesis statement was just the visceral imagery that we get in a lot of these cult scenes, specifically this sort of suicide scene of these two old people jumping off the edge of the cliff in front of the cult and the American visitors. And I guess there's two British visitors there too. First and foremost, this is just a really very visceral scene. As an audience member, you're sitting there and you're watching these people jump off of this cliff, and they very graphically show you them hitting the ground. The woman jumps horizontally, and you see her face just completely busted open on this rock, and then the man jumps vertically, and he breaks his legs, and to finish him off, they have to hit him with a hammer, and they take turns hitting him with this big old mallet on his face. And a lot of the cult members are reacting to this and sort of sharing in the pain. So as these people are jumping off, and the man isn't dead quite yet, the cult members are all like, and like really partaking in this trauma and this pain that these dead are going through. And that's something that I'll talk about a little bit more in a moment. But like I was saying, very visceral, very... you feel something when you're watching this scene. It's not just like, scratch my chin about this one. This one is like, whoa! You really get delivered to this moment emotionally, so very good directing and just interesting writing in that perspective. And also, I think it supports our thesis statement by giving Danny a contrasting experience to suicide and trauma. So in the opening of the film, obviously her sister kills herself and kills her parents, and Danny is distraught, very emotionally traumatized by this experience. But then, once we get into this cult circumstance, they have a similar experience of suicide, but it's celebrated, and it's actually something that's honorable and something that is good for the community and brings their family closer together. And so this is a good way of introducing Danny's character arc of her addressing this trauma of this suicide, that when her family went through this traumatic event, it destroyed her family, and her boyfriend wasn't able to emotionally be there for her. But then in this cult circumstance, they have suicide in such a way that it is meaningful and brings everybody closer together. And we'll support that arc for her a little bit more throughout the course of the video, but that, I think, from the get-go is pretty successful. Also, just to zero in a little bit more on this like community empathy theme that goes throughout the film, very visceral to see everybody writhing and sort of, I think I'm saying this right, ululating or ululating, but just like very, very publicly crying and moaning to this painful experience. And this is something that gets demonstrated at various points throughout the film. Also, when Danny catches her boyfriend having sex with that redhead in that weird sex ritual, all of the naked women that are around this couple having sex are sort of orgasming rhythmically and empathetically as a community. And when Danny catches them doing this, a lot of the women that comfort Danny likewise share in her pain and her moaning and screaming at seeing her boyfriend cheat on her in this way. And this is probably some of the most effective, like, visceral moment, or one of the most visceral moments in the film, even more so than some of the more gory or kind of crazy traumatic things. Just seeing everybody share in this pain together, it sent chills up my spine watching this, specifically all of the women around her in the main sleeping area when she's screaming and moaning, and they're all screaming rhythmically together. Very affecting, but then also it thematically supports that main thesis statement that I was talking about, is that beforehand, when her sister kills herself and kills her parents, Danny is alone. Her boyfriend isn't really there to be emotionally available for her, and he's missing all of her cues. Whereas when she's in this cult circumstance, they are so emotionally empathetic that they literally share in her pain with her. So this is, I think, supporting her joining this cult and entering into this family system where, rather than being emotionally isolated, everybody shares in on this pain together, and it's a beautiful celebration of family and togetherness. So I hope I've communicated that to you well. And I don't think that's too controversial to say that that is a big element of the film. I think you're supposed to take that from Midsommar. So let me see if there's anything more. Okay, I'll say just one more thing. And this isn't necessarily as much about that general thesis statement, but just more of a general positive thing about the film. I think a lot of the directing and editing are very good, and just the colors and very sunny imagery of them outdoors. And something that I didn't really fully appreciate until one of my friends explained it to me is that Sweden is almost completely dark and wintry most of the year, except for around that midsummer time, when they have many days of daylight where the sun doesn't completely end up going down all the way. And so I think that had I known that going into this film, it might have brought a little bit more to it for me, but it makes sense now that during the opening, it's these long contemplative shots of these trees in the winter and snow just pouring down. And then the rest of the film ends up being in this summery circumstance. And I think maybe you could argue that, when Danny becomes the May Queen, I think they call her, when she's covered in flowers, not only is this like a beautiful costuming choice for her, she almost looks like a bug with her little flowery crown and her just completely covered in flowers. You could argue that maybe her character was in a sort of emotional winter before this, and so in addition to having this interesting, visually striking flower costume, perhaps thematically her character is blooming or coming into new life after a long, extended emotional winter. So, pretty cool. I don't have too much to say about editing because I am not an editor or necessarily, I don't really play that role in the filmmaking process. But the fact that I noticed some interesting edits in this film tells me that they were doing something good. Because usually I don't notice editing in a movie unless it's like a very bad. But in this case, I noticed it was like, wow, that seems like a smart cut that really undercuts this, supports a good emotional moment, but I'll get off of that for now. So let's get into some things that I think maybe were a little bit weak or could have been communicated more clearly or handled a little bit more delicately, maybe some missed opportunities in this film. So before I get into this, I don't think any of these things I'm about to say ruin this film. I brought up some of these complaints to some of the people that I saw it with, and I think that maybe some people thought that I didn't like this film, and overall I did. I thought it was an awesome viewing experience, but there were a few things that left me a little bit dry, or maybe I need to go in and see this movie again to see if maybe it was handled in a way that I just missed on my first viewing. So I think that overall, some of the way that the suspense was handled in this film could have been done a little bit better or more mysteriously, or just done in a more interesting way. And before I describe that, let me tell you that I mentioned this to one of my friends that I saw it with, and his point was that that is actually one of the successful points in the film, is that this is a horror film that doesn't rely on a lot of suspense in order to deliver its visceral emotions and interesting thematic investigation. But even though this might have been an interesting challenge for the director to pull off, I think that you can still make a horror film that doesn't rely on suspense for its horror. However, just as a story, I think that some of these suspenseful moments could have been built or handled more mysteriously in order to just deliver the story in a more dynamic, interesting way, not necessarily the horror elements. So, to maybe get a more in-depth discussion of what I mean by suspense and anticipation of action, I do have another video on that, so check that out. It's in a playlist called The Bare Bones of Story. So I won't get in too much about the difference between like horror suspense and then story suspense, but just so you know, for the purposes of this discussion, I am talking about story suspense. So I think some of the unsuccessful ways of handling this story suspense in the film is a lot of the suspenseful moments or moments that promise you something that's going to happen later in the film are just delivered on too directly. Like the character or the film will tell you what's going to happen, and then that thing happens. So it became a little too predictable for me in this way. Still, a lot of the moments were good, but let me get into these moments that I'm talking about. Let's see. So, for example, the whole thing with her boyfriend getting sacrificed at the end, I thought it was a little too obvious that he was so emotionally unavailable to her. It would have been more interesting, in my opinion, if maybe she had to discover that her boyfriend was this deadweight, that he was not very emotionally communicative, that he didn't pick up on a lot of her emotional cues when she needed him after this traumatic event. We're sort of beat over the head with the fact that she is a bad boyfriend from the get-go. A lot of the initial framings of him are him like as a reflection in the window, and I think that maybe this device was relied on a little bit too much. That I think that like when he comes over to comfort her at the beginning of the film, he is in like a narrow mirror, and that's how he is in the scene. And then later, when he is hanging out with his friends, and then she comes over to help plan the Sweden trip, he is shown in the reflection of a window. And I get it, it's a pretty easily interpretable image that we're seeing a reflection of him like a shallow representation rather than his substantiated form in the frame. So it's not like a meaningless image, but just from the get-go, we're like, oh, there's some issues with this boyfriend. And then time and again, she is reaching out to him for emotional support and connection, and he denies it to her. Now, again, you could argue that this is exactly what the film was trying to do with his character, that he is not emotionally available to her. He is not a very good boyfriend. He is maybe selfish and maybe a little basic. And what the character ends up needing to do is to cut him out of her life, or maybe even sacrifice him in a cult circumstance. And it's just a little too predictable to me. That I think, again, it might have been more interesting had, he maybe had been a supportive boyfriend, but there were just some key moments where he wasn't as emotionally invested or emotionally available. But just from the get-go, you just see, it's like, oh yeah, their relationship is falling apart. And then I think even in the way that they describe this film in, like, IMDb, it's like, a couple whose relationship is on the verge of collapse. Just to put a pin on that, I think it would have been more interesting if she had to discover that, or the audience had to discover that he was not as emotionally attentive as he could be. But again, they basically spoon-feed you this throughout the film. So I'll move on from that. Another instance of this that I don't think is as important, but it's just another example of the suspense being too directly delivered on, is that when Pele, their Swedish friend who brings them to this festival in the first place, is talking about the various stages of life that these cult members go through, they ask him what happens after the age of 72, and he just goes. And then shortly after, we get the ceremony of them jumping off of the cliff. And to me, it just seemed like kind of too... It was just like telegraphing what was going to happen in the film. It's like, oh yeah, we kill them, or they die after they get to the age of 72. And then that's exactly what happens. It would have been more interesting if he had just been maybe more foreboding about this and had said maybe after the age of 72, something happens, and then we have to make some more guesses about this, but he just goes, and then we find out that they die. So, again, that I think could have been handled maybe a little bit more delicately. The same thing goes for Pele's interest in Danny, that I think in one of his earlier scenes, he's like drawing something and she asks him what he's drawing and he like puts it away really fast. And it just seemed like too obvious that it was calling the audience's attention to the fact that Pele may have some ulterior motives to bring new, fresh blood into the cult, which ends up getting investigated. And there's another scene where Danny is talking to Christian, her boyfriend, and is mentioning that the British guy leaves his fiancée without telling her. Obviously, he's been killed, and they just lie and said that he asked to be taken back to the station. And Danny brings this up to Christian, concerned, being like, hey, that's kind of weird. They were in love, and like in every scene that they're together, they're all over each other and hugging and embracing, and they serve as a good loving contrast to the sort of emotional disconnect that Danny and Christian are going through. But when she brings this up to Christian, he is very dismissive, and it's just like, yeah, it's what they said. He just wanted to leave. It's not weird at all that he didn't tell his fiancée that he was leaving. And then he sort of interrupts her in order to continue talking to Pele, and then Pele says something along the lines of, we need fresh blood, and we get this long push-in on Danny. And to me, it just seemed like it was too obvious that they're being like, oh, I wonder who the fresh blood is going to be. It's obviously going to be her, and I think it might have been a little bit more interesting if they didn't project this as much or telegraph this as much. It's like, oh, she's going to be the May Queen, she's going to be the fresh blood, so that they don't have a bunch of incest babies. And that's exactly what ends up happening. Let me move on from that. I don't need to beat a dead horse. Same thing goes with the redhead's interest in Christian. It just seemed a little too directly promised and delivered on. It's like, oh, this redhead likes him. And we get this sort of like multi-picture, I don't know what you call that, but they sort of pan on the sheet that has these images drawn on it that basically telegraphs exactly what is going to happen between the redhead and Christian, that she ends up cutting some of her pubic hair and feeding it to him in this like love ritual sort of thing, and it just seemed like a little too like, hey, this is what's going to happen, and then that's what happened. You know, maybe had there been more mystery to the images that would have been, I think, more interesting or delicately delivered. And then two, I would specifically love to hear everybody's feedback on this. The whole argument that he has with his friend over who's going to write their thesis on the Midsommar Festival seemed like a big step backward to me. That we are promised all of this interesting investigation of occult rituals and sacrifice and suicide and trauma and emotional empathy and community togetherness, and then we get this like argument over these guys arguing about their theses. Maybe I'm missing something here. So I would love to be wrong about this, that if somebody could argue how this was more relevant to the film, but this almost seemed like this sort of collegiate competitive BS that really distracted from the film, in my opinion. And maybe if he was insisting on keeping this investigation of like the theses of these students, that it could have had something to do with like an outsider's perspective on this cult versus the experience of the people who were in the cult. But I just don't know if this was handled very well. And when they were arguing and like getting jealous of each other, both trying to cover the summer festival for their thesis, I just remember being like, what? We just got all these mushroom trips and these suicide ceremonies, and now we're like supposed to care about these guys like arguing who's going to get to do their thesis over this thing. It just felt very like studenty to me, and this otherwise like enormous backdrop that gives you all of these interesting opportunities for things to play with. Like, for example, I would have rather seen a much deeper dive on this kid who's the product of incest that is writing these scriptures for them. And in the trailer, it almost seemed to be promised a little bit more that this kid was going to get a little bit more screen time, but he ends up, even though he's important to the story, he doesn't really get a lot of screen time, and I would have so much rather seen more about him than these guys like arguing about their theses for their school projects. So let me just sort of summarize everything. I don't want to make this video too long. I think that overall this is still an amazing movie that has some really interesting scenes in it, but I think that some of my issues and writing critiques on this are a distraction from this promise that we give, which again I have identified to be when Danny's sister kills herself and her parents, Danny goes to a midsummer festival where she develops a new sense of family, addresses the trauma of her sister's suicide and double homicide, and gets rid of her shitty boyfriend. Some of my issues with the suspense in this film, I think, sort of distract from this main investigation. And again, the last shot of the film, I think, still delivers on this to a certain extent, that Danny's performance is almost marked by this really good frown that, what's her name? Pugh, what's her name? The main character. Florence Pugh is an excellent, or does a really good job of delivering this very dreary and sad performance, and her frown is just so prominent that I wonder if Ari Aster had specifically directed her to give us this really prominent frown, because she's got a lot of very great beats in the story of her just wandering around like, ugh. And then the last shot of the film is her boyfriend burning up in the big pyramid, this like yellow building, when he's in a bear suit, and then she like smiles. So that is pretty well done in my estimation, but everything leading up to that, it seems to get a little lost in these long contemplative shots of these ceremonial dinners and meals that they're having, and I don't know if he really led me to this last scene. So I think I'm going to leave it at that, because I feel like I'm kind of grasping at straws at this point. I hope that I've communicated what I thought was successful about this film and some things that could have been improved on. Again, please leave in the comments anything that you have to say about these students' theses and the argument over who gets to do the thesis. That was the biggest thing in this film that I was just like, oh, really? Like, we have to care about that now? I just didn't want to... I thought the whole movie could have been improved if we didn't have to talk about these guys doing their theses. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I missed something, and that is an essential part of this film, so I'd love to hear about that. I hope that some of the things that I mentioned today can help you write better stories. And again, I don't want anyone to finish watching this video thinking that I hated this film or anything like that. It's still amazing. I'm still very excited to see everything that Ari Aster does in the future. because all things considered, this was a really, really cool movie. So please leave some comments, like and subscribe if you got the time, and yeah, try to write better stories. God knows I'm trying to.